Hi, my name is Chris, aka The Philosopher's Games, or TPhGames as my little games channel here is called, and today we look into the settings of the Elden Ring item and enemy randomizer. In the last video I explained how to install the item and enemy randomizer and also combine it with seamless co-op and the Focate randomizer, and gave a brief overview of some of the settings, and now we look deeper into the settings. Speaking of settings, I also provide an options file that you can import into the randomizer, and then everything is set up automatically, and then you can fine-tune the settings from there, for example. Let us start with the item randomizer page, and there with the first setting called bias. This is a setting where people often ask, what does it actually do? Bias tries to create long key item chains and makes later and more difficult bosses more rewarding. To quote thefifthmatt, the creator of the randomizer, at 0% anything has an equal chance of going anywhere it's allowed to go, as determined by important locations, specific balancing restrictions, etc. At 100%, the randomizer tries to make key items unlock other key items and put better stuff later and behind difficult bosses, etc. So it's more predictable, but also more rewarding. If you set up certain requirements to, for example, enter the mountaintops, like finding 4 great runes, which is quite common in many formats I play, then if you put bias to 0%, you can just find all the required great runes pretty much in Limgrave at a very early stage in the game, and then you are practically already in go mode and don't have to explore the other stuff. This you kind of change a bit if you increase bias a bit. Usually when I play randomizer, I set it roundabout to 20%, but 0% can in certain formats also be very interesting. So to avoid misunderstandings, 0% can be just very wild. You can find everything early, but you can also find everything quite late, and then it takes longer. You don't know. It depends on the seed and on your luck. The overall seed you can set at the bottom. Not much to explain. The number is basically the randomness, and everybody who uses the same number gets the same result. So you can, for example, race against other people and so on. Of course, the result is only the same if you use the same settings. There is the option to export the options file, and due to this you can just send somebody the options file and then it should be the same. In the next section, the concept of important locations is introduced, and that is very important. You can set for major key items, flask upgrades, upgrade bell bearings and Shadow Realm blessings that they are not randomized at all, that they are randomized to basically every possible item location, and that they are randomized to only important locations. And what important locations are, you can define on the left side. Without using custom item placement, you can't deselect vanilla locations of major key items and major bosses. Also, it shows you the number of checks in this category, and you can even click on this and it shows you what checks these actually are, which is pretty cool. On the bottom you have exclude mini dungeon locations. I usually have this activated because I don't like mini dungeons, but if you like them, you have the option to include them as well, which mainly affects the other bosses category. These settings determine how long your run will be. Do you want a very long run and want to check every item in the game? You can do that by setting everything to anywhere, or at least some of these options. And also you can add more and more checks, like all the other bosses, including mini dungeons, and you have to basically do a 100% run and check everything. If you want to have like a smooth run that you can complete in a couple of hours, then you have to reduce the number of checks and also work with this important location setting. Then we have the setting spell shops still sell spells. You should activate this if you really plan to make, for example, a spells only run. If you plan on not using any spells in your run, you should deactivate it. This just gives you more shops where you can potentially find good items. The next setting is, in my opinion, one of the most important ones: smithing stone availability similar to vanilla. What this means is that in Limgrave you find smithing stone 1 and 2, In Leonia, 3 and 4. In Kaled also 3, 4, potentially 5 and 6. In Altus, 5 and 6. In Ferrum Azula and Mountaintops also 7 and 8 with potential of ancient smithing stones as well. Keep in mind, it's a randomizer, so there are sometimes exceptions to this. This is not set into stone. Randomize collectible materials like raw fruit. This is pretty straightforward and randomizes the collectible flora of the lands between, which can be quite potent for crafting, because some of the rare materials you need for certain recipes, like some greases, lightning greases, fire greases and so on, they won't respawn if you rest at a grace, so they are limited when it comes to picking them up, and this changes with this randomize functionality, because now they can be respawnable plants. Of course, these rare materials in the base game, you can farm certain enemies to get an unlimited supply also of the rare materials or the rare plants, but that often takes a lot of time. Add guaranteed copies of random enemy drops. For a very long time I did not know what this setting does exactly, and I did some research on the developer Discord and found an answer to it. And it's very interesting and a very useful setting, I think. What it does is that it generates copies of random enemy drops, like the brass shield, the bandit's curved sword, potentially even the bloodhound's fang, and adds those copies to the pool of items that can be picked up from the ground. So you can find them as enemy drop, but you can also pick them up from the ground. This results in that more corpses give you multiple items when you loot them. Place Shadow Realm blessings in DLC only. This can be an important setting if you separate base game from DLC. There's a setting for that we come to in a moment. I think this is an interesting setting because it places these schedule tree or schedule tree fragments also then in the base game if you deactivate it, and this can prepare you for the DLC on one hand. On the other hand, it can also, if you are unlucky, force you to do a lot of base game progress to find enough blessings to help you out in the DLC. If you activate this, you kill one boss in the DLC and usually get like 5 schedule tree fragments, so you can get already some of these Shadow Realm blessings as a result, and you know where to find them more easily, and I think it is recommended to turn this on, to be honest, especially if you separate base game and DLC. And it can a bit depend on your playstyle. If you, for example, switch between DLC and base game a lot, then maybe it can be worth turning it off, but I usually have it turned on. Then there's custom item placement. In that you have tons of options. It's sometimes a bit buggy. You can, for example, exclude certain items from being randomized, and you also can define other things that then become also important locations. It's very powerful, and maybe I add a section about it at the end of the video or in a separate video. Then we move to the Logic tab, which has some very interesting and important options. We start with game progression. This is a very interesting one because here, as mentioned, you can define what is required to end the game or to get the rolled medallion, to get access to the mountaintops, or get access to the capital Leyndell. The idea behind this is that you have a goal that you have to reach to be in go mode, as you call it in randomizer runs. So you have 4 great runes, you can now access the mountaintops as an example, and then you are in go mode and can complete the game. In this context, of course, the great runes count as key items, and in the tab of the item randomizer, you can set the key items, of course, to important locations and define which locations you have to check. And this is commonly used in randomizer races to have a goal to work for and get a certain speed to get through the game. By default, you need 2 great runes to enter Leyndell in the base game, but you can also put it to 0. Another special case is that when it comes to great runes to enter mountaintops, you can also select the 2 dashes. This means that the rolled medallion is also in the pool of key items. If you put this to 0, you get the key item instantly when you reach rolled and stand before it. And if you put it to any number, you need to fulfill this requirement to get the medallion there. but you also get it in front of rolled. Then we have the option deathless routing. And this is mostly important if you want to do randomizer no death. Because in this case, the randomizer in its logic considers that you won't use the intentional death to the abductor version or in the randomizer by just falling down and dying at the bottom of the Lucaria Academy where the abductor version would normally stand. And this teleports you then after the death screen to the Volcano Manor. This is then excluded from the logic and you can complete the randomizer seed without using this. Then we have an option I'm not too familiar with, but I've tried it out and it's called hints. And there you can purchase at Calais hints for where key items are. If you activate both options, you even have the option to get the exact location of a key item. But not only that, also of other useful items like sacred tears, specifically talisman pouches, the sentry torch and so on. So that can be actually quite helpful in this regard, though I find that the key item location hint is not that important because it shows you the location of any key item, not only of great runes. So you maybe get the academy key, the Harlotry medallion, the rusted key, and then get the location of a great rune. Those locations are marked with a red marker on the map, you know, from the base game. And like I said, either you get roundabout which area it is or the exact location of it. And it costs runes, round about 10,000 runes for the roundabout location. The precise location I think costs 25,000 runes, so it's quite expensive early on. Though when you're slowly entering the late game and are still on flask +1 or whatever, then maybe checking out some sacred tier locations can be quite worth it. But I have this pretty much always deactivated. Then we have key item placement. Early legacy dungeons are available early. Place rusty key in Limgrave and academy key in Leonia. Pretty straightforward. With this, the academy key, for example, is always in Leonia and the rusty key is always in Limgrave. For example, if you want to check Godric and you forget to let Gostok open the gate, then you have to find the rusty key. And also in these important location settings, the academy is an extremely powerful item check because it has 3 checks in of itself plus fast access to Volcano Manor, which also has 3 checks. Talking to Tennis, giving you the drawing room key is also a check. And from there, over the abductor virgin boss, you can also get early access to Altus Plateau. So this gives you a lot of options. Also, early Mogwin Palace is quite interesting because there is a merchant, only 1 item check, but you have a lot of potential for late game smithing stones and items. So it's a good place to check in my opinion, though the boss fight is highly scaled and a late game fight and can often be quite tough, so keep this in mind. In addition, if you have killed Radahn already, this gives you access to the DLC as well. Randomize base game DLC and key items separately. I like this setting, but it basically defines the scope of your run. If you want to do everything in the game, including the DLC, to find your, for example, 4 great runes for mountaintops, then you could uncheck this. Usually I like, though, to have the key items separated, so I can basically complete the base game, and then if I so desire I can go into the DLC and complete that as well. Randomize Lamentis jail keys. This is also pretty straightforward. It basically adds 2 more locations to find key items at, and those are in the Lamentis jail, the 2 keys you can find there. It's relatively hard to reach, so I rarely see people turning this on, me included, but it is available. There was once a cool stake skip to get to the area of the Lamentis jail faster, which is called Karen's Hidden Grave, I think, and this got patched in 1.4, so you have to ride even more if you turn this on, and the DLC is already a lot of riding. Maybe if the randomizer gives you an error message and says not enough key item locations, then you can maybe turn this on to get these extra key item locations. Keep this in mind. The next two settings are a very cool idea and in my opinion also quite important for DLC runs, especially if you want to race against somebody or so, because this basically adds the idea of finding a certain amount of great runes, which allows you then to get into go mode and finish the game just with a DLC. You don't have any great runes in the DLC. Okay, Mikola's great rune is there, but that's kind of just a special case item. But in vanilla DLC, you just have to defeat Mesmer to get the Mesmer kindling. This allows you to burn down the tree, and this allows you to enter Enir Ilim, where you can then fight against the final boss of the DLC. This setting now allows you to divide the Mesmer kindling into a specific amount of Mesmer kindling shards you have to find in the game. Those are then key item checks, and of course to find those Mesmer kindling shards you have to do your key item checks, for example killing the major bosses in the DLC, and as soon as you have the required amount, let's say 5, you are in go mode and can go to the tree, burn it down, and from there complete the DLC. I like this setting a lot because it gives you a sense for your progression and also a goal what you have to achieve to complete the DLC, so that's pretty cool in my opinion. Also, as hinted at, you can get an error message if there are too many key items on too little locations for the DLC to be placed. In this case, you have to reduce the key items. For example, you could go to the DLC start settings, activate those, DLC start with base game for example, and then give all memory stones so that the memory stones are already removed from the pool of the key items to basically reduce the max amount of key items the game has to place, because at a specific location only a certain amount of key items can appear. And of course, if give all memory stones is not enough, then you can, for example, give all wet blades, give all talisman pouches, and so on. Then we move to the enemy randomizer tab. First we have game progression, scale up or down, enemy health and damage. This setting is very important because if you, for example, go into the market boss room and this is turned off and you find, I don't know, Melania there, it is the original Melania in all her glory and she's not scaled down at all. Good luck fighting her with your +1 weapon. Melania is also kind of a special case because she counts as one phase boss even though she has both phases in one fight, which is different from all the other 2-phase boss fights. As a result, she can't appear in boss fights that have 2 phases in the randomizer, except you force the randomizer to do it differently. Scale up or down multi-phase bosses slightly. This also goes into the same direction. So most boss fights like Malikes and Beast Clergymen or Godfrey, Horalu, those are split as separate boss fights in the randomizer. So if you fight Godfrey in the first phase and it's replaced by, let's say, Elden Beast, then in the second phase you can get Gaius. And to make it a bit more fair, in these multi-phase boss fights, they are scaled down a bit. On the other side, if you get a weaker enemy like the already damaged assassin, then it's scaled up a bit. Edit boss names. This is a very fun setting. I would just recommend trying it out and getting some little Easter eggs here and there, but it just changes the boss names to represent what boss you're currently fighting. Randomize boss background music. This just switches around the boss background music for all the boss fights in the game, so you get a random boss fight theme out of the pool of boss tracks. Change boss runes when the boss changes. So if you get, let's say in Margit's boss arena, Melania, and you activate this, you won't get 480,000 runes, but Melania scaled down 480,000 runes, so a bit less, but still more than your usually 12k you get from Margit. That also means if you turn this setting off, you get 12,000 runes in the Margit boss arena, no matter what boss you fight there. So the default rune amount of this boss arena, so to say. I usually turn this off because it makes your expected rune income more predictable. Swap bosses between multi-boss fights for mini-dungeon bosses only. So there are certain mini-dungeon bosses like the Crucible Knight duo, and this basically replaces them with other mini-dungeon bosses or bosses. So you can get the Crucible Knight and, I don't know, one of these Beastmen of Farum Azula. Multi-boss fights means in this context boss fights where you have multiple bosses in this boss fight you fight at the same time. And you have to kill both to defeat the boss, but this only affects mini-dungeon bosses. Spawn night bosses at all hours. Pretty straightforward, then all the night bosses appear all the time. There are certain night bosses that are behind a merchant, for example, like Bernal or something, and in this case, the night boss only appears if you have at least talked to the merchant once and exhausted the dialogue, and then it will always be the night boss there until you defeat it, of course. So you have one chance to get the bell bearing of the merchant. This is also a feature always activated in the randomizer that not all merchant, but some of the generic merchants, you have an option to instantly receive its bell bearing without killing the merchant. We skip custom enemy placement for now and come to ignore arena size for boss placement. If you are new to randomizer runs, I would not activate this option because it can be very painful in a way, because it can result that, I don't know, Placido Sex appears in a very small boss arena. If you do a lot of randomizer runs, I can recommend maybe thinking about turning this on, because otherwise big bosses only appear in big boss arenas, but the pool of big bosses and big boss arenas is relatively small, so we'll always see the same, 20 bosses in the same arenas. That can be very predictable and in some cases flat out annoying. A good example would be Valiant Gargoyles in Radagon's boss arena, which can be really tough in the randomizer. Impolite enemies. You maybe have noticed if you fight multiple enemies, if you fight one in the group, the others get a bit passive. And I think this setting reduces this effect quite a bit, which can make the game more annoying. I don't know why you would turn this on, except for self-hate. Then there's the option for a separate enemy seed. So basically if you want to say, I want to have the same items I had before, I like the weapons and stuff a lot, but I want to have different enemy combinations, then you could put in here a different seed. Now we come to custom item placement. If you activate it, you get the option to click on edit custom enemy placement, and then a new window pops up and you get like a ton of options what you can do there. Randomize DLC separately for all bosses and enemies. So basically that in the vanilla game you only have vanilla enemies, and in the DLC you only have DLC enemies mixed up and randomized. Increase HP for regular enemies as bosses. In theory, you can click on major bosses and then basically say that also regular enemies can be placed as bosses. And then they will get their HP increased to make it more of a challenge. Reduce HP for bosses as regular enemies. Basically the other way around. You can say that among the regular enemies, some bosses appear, and then the HP are also a bit reduced to make it more handleable. Reduce HP for bosses in Enemy Onslaught slightly. Enemy Onslaught is a specific mode which you can set to 2 times or 3 times and so on. And what it does is basically if you go into a boss room, you won't fight one boss, but 2 bosses or 3 bosses at the same time. So this can be highly annoying, and this setting can make things a little bit more manageable here. Also, this applies to normal enemies as well. So if you had one Godric soldier in one place, then there might be a Godric soldier and a worm face or whatever. If you click on one of the categories below, for example on regular enemies, you can change the onslaught for each category. For example, you could say regular enemies 1 time, and then the normal regular enemies won't be there 2 times. The bosses and enemies are randomized, and also their duplicates are also randomized differently, if that makes sense. Speaking of game modes, there is the enemy onslaught as mentioned, but there's also oops all, and then you can basically set it to Melania, and then every enemy in the game is Melania. So this basically does this. You can also limit it to a certain pool of enemies and so on. So this is a fast way if you just want to have a very specific enemy all the time. color code bosses and enemy onslaught. This basically gives each boss duplicate in enemy onslaught a different color, so you can differentiate them. This is especially useful if all the bosses are the same boss, so you know which one you already attacked and which one not. Randomly scale enemies. This is a setting you should potentially avoid, except you hate yourself too much, because then every scaling on every enemy and boss you encounter is scaled randomly. So you go into the market boss arena and you have an enemy that is suddenly scaled on DLC level, and then, I don't know, you enter the boss room of Radagon and it's the same scaling as Rick, Soldier of God. So with a bit of bad luck, you can bring serious roadblocks in your way with this. Only scale enemies up. This is another setting which I think I've never used before, but as far as I understand it, it basically looks at the original scaling of the boss you are fighting and then checks if the current scaling in this area would scale it down. If that is the case, this won't happen and it just keeps the original scaling. Otherwise, if the scaling is higher anyway, then it does nothing, because then the enemy is scaled up. When I searched for more information about this setting on the developer's Discord, I also noticed that the developer mentioned that he was potentially switching things around how random enemy scaling works and how only scale up enemies work, because originally it was like that the random enemy scaling would replace the original scaling of the boss, so to say, and then this would become the new target for if the enemy is scaled up or down. As a result, only scale enemies up would behave strangely in combination with randomly scale enemies. But this post was like 2 years old, so I don't know how things changed after that. Then we have not randomized, which is also an important setting, because this excludes a specific enemy or a group of enemies from being randomized at all in the randomizer. I, for example, like to put aging untouchables on this list, so they are still in the game in their original location in the DLC, but they won't disturb you, for example, in a boss fight, because if they get aggro, they can teleport into, for example, a boss room and annoy you there. Excluded everywhere. Pretty straightforward. A boss on this list or an enemy on this list won't appear in the run. It's excluded from the game. As a result, if you add bosses to this list, some bosses have to appear multiple times to compensate. Classics that you could consider putting on this list would be the invisible Black Knife Assassin boss, because you won't always find a sentry torch, or the Divine Beast, Dancing Lion and Basilisk, because it's really annoying. And especially if it appears in a very small boss arena, it's almost impossible to kill because you always get the Death Blight first. Also, consider putting some of your most hated bosses on this list as well, just to make the run more fun. Valiant Gargoyles. Excuse me, I'm allergic to bullshit. Then next we have the enemy category list here, and here things get a bit complicated. I think the most straightforward is regular enemies. You have the option to click on not randomized or custom. Not randomized obviously keeps the regular enemies in the game, so everything that is not a boss as it is. If you click on custom, you now have the option to randomize DLC separately from the base game when it comes to regular enemies. You also can here put enemies on the exclude list, so when it comes to regular enemies, these enemies on this list won't appear in the game. And then you can click on the little plus symbol, and this basically allows you to define an enemy or a group of enemies and give that a probability how likely it is to appear in the game. If you define nothing here, it will just take the group of all regular enemies and also randomize them. And then you have a lot of other categories, and all of them are about bosses except for hostile humans, scarabs and passive wildlife. Passive wildlife are just the little critters running around in the world, and you could also replace them with bosses. Keep this in mind. Also, if you define a new group with its probability in a specific category, all your defined groups have to add up to 100%. So if you want that 10% of regular enemies become bosses, you put this to, 10% all bosses and 90% same category regular enemies. Also, there is a group in the list that is called not randomized. So you could, for example, say that 50% of the enemies are not randomized. But for this to work, you have to define a source group that has a probability of 50% first. If we now come to the interesting major bosses settings and also potentially the world, mini bosses and minor bosses settings and so on, there is an interesting detail you have to understand. If you click on major bosses and there on custom, you can set up your custom settings for this category. If you then click on minor bosses, you have two options. Either click there on custom as well and define there your groups with their probabilities, or click on merge with major bosses. If you, for example, set major bosses to 100% all bosses and you merge minor bosses with it, it uses the same pool. So in this case, no additional duplicates of bosses are added to the game, except, of course, you exclude certain bosses. Those excluded bosses have to be replaced by duplicates, of course. In contrast, if you click on custom in one of the other categories like minor bosses, you create a new pool. So bosses can appear there again as duplicate because it has its own pool, which can have the same bosses as the other category. Same would also happen if you use copy config from major bosses if you click on the minor bosses category. Then it uses just the config. I assume it also creates a new pool as you would do the same in custom. If you make a run where you want to fight all 207 or whatever the amount is bosses in Elden Ring and DLC, you have to define there nothing or 100% all bosses, and then merge all the other boss categories with it, or with each other to be precise. And then also no boss should be on the excluded lists. Then you also have frequency adjustments. The example here in the explanation text is, for example, setting crabs to 50% will cut their chance of appearing in half. And then you have the option of manual placement, where you can define a specific enemy and basically say, he should be replaced by this enemy or by one enemy out of this group. And this overrides all the other settings. Next is the DLC tab. Under overall randomization, you can decide if you want to randomize DLC and base game together or separately. It might be that custom item placement can override this though. That means if you separate it, DLC stuff stays in the DLC and base game stuff stays in base game. Upgrade all weapons in the DLC to max level. If you find a weapon inside the DLC, it will be upgraded to its max already. So to +10 for somber weapons or +25 for smithing stone weapons. And if you find a weapon in the base game, it is not upgraded at all. Abyssal Woods Horse Blinders. This allows you simply to use torrent in the Abyssal Woods, because usually you have to walk through that area, and it is not that interesting after several playthroughs, so this accelerates things quite a bit. Randomize Spirit Spring Seals. Each stone stack unseals a random Spirit Spring. This is very random. I have pretty much never used this setting, but it can be interesting if you want to explore a lot and find where you now opened a new path by finding one of these stone stacks. So it can be interesting, but I think it's very niche. The rest of the options are the so-called DLC start options. By default, it's normal progression, so basically nothing changes for you. But then you have the option DLC start and DLC start with base game. What this does is giving you a grace in the Chapel of Anticipation at the very beginning of the game. You can't open the door and you have to sit at the bonfire. And there, depending on the other settings you select here, you get a lot of options. For example, if you set up an initial rune level, you get the amount of runes in this room. And as soon as you sit down at the grace and select DLC start and teleport into the base game or in the DLC, depending on your options, you lose all the remaining runes. So you have to spend them there. That's very important. Also, you can activate a base game shop, which allows you to get equipment for free to set up your character if you want. But also there is a base game care package, which you could also limit to basically just utility items. And you have also DLC start upgrades. Give all sacred flasks, fully upgraded sacred flasks, so that means the sacred tiers are in it. give all talisman pouches, give all memory stones, so you have the spell slots, give all wet blades, so you have all the upgrade options, and activate all upgrade bell bearings, I assume for the Twin Maiden Husk in the roundtable hold. Also, you can activate that you can go to the roundtable hold from the start, which gives you access to torrent instantly. And these are basically your DLC start options here. You can experiment a bit with it. If you select DLC start only, you might have to reduce the amount of key items you have to find. So under logic, I would set everything to 0, and you potentially won't be able to enter the base game anyway. And you might have to also add the randomized Lamentus jail keys, because you need additional locations for key items to get everything there. Each check can only have a certain amount of key items it can drop, and as a result, you might get an error here. And with this, we finally reached the Misc Options tab, the last one. Randomize starting class loadouts. As the name suggests, this randomizes what equipment and weapons the starting classes, which you can select during the character creation, have. This gives you a ton of options for the randomizer run, and also a potential weapon that you might want to fall back on in case you don't find a good weapon during your run. It has several sub-options. For example, allow weapons requiring two-handing. This means your strength modifier, if you two-hand a weapon, is multiplied by 1.5. So with 16 strength, you can wield a weapon that requires 24 strength. And this is then considered if you activate this option. So as a result, you get much more options for weapons activating this. So I would usually recommend going with at least this. The next one is allow only one-handable weapons. This reduces the weapon pool that you have to weapons that you can wield with one hand. So only weapons where you fulfill the requirements with the base stats of the according class. You can also activate allow changing stats slightly for more starting weapons. So this increases your possible weapon pool further and make things potentially more interesting. There's also an option for limiting starting items to DLC items only. If you want to try out more DLC stuff, that's also a cool option. And last, allow unwieldable weapons and spells. So you can get basically any weapon in the game as a starting weapon, and often you don't have the stats to wield those. And it even shows you if you select the class, how many levels are missing to actually use the weapon. If you combine randomizer with Foggate randomizer, I would recommend to not use allow unwieldable weapons and spells, or at least use it at your own risk, because you can run early into a boss and then you have to fight him with a weapon where you don't have the stats for. The next options are all pretty straightforward. Randomize starting keepsakes. So the list of keepsakes at the beginning is randomized and you get random items there. Randomize NPC outfits, so friendly and enemy NPCs have pretty wild and random outfits. Randomize ambient music, so also the ambient music in the game is randomized. Randomize gestures, so gestures that you find in the game and also start with are randomized as far as I'm aware. Randomize enemy colors, so enemies have these weird random colors and it often makes it hard to see what attack they are currently doing, so I would usually turn this off, but if you're in it for the lulz, maybe try it out. And then special modes is also quite interesting. Remove all weapon and spell requirements. This is quite interesting because it allows you to wield any weapon in the game, but keep in mind that you might do a lot less damage by not fulfilling the base requirements of the weapons as you are potentially used to. Of course, you do normal damage with a weapon, you can wield it, but since you have less stats, you also do less damage with it. Unrestricted item placement for Foggate randomizer. This is, as the name suggests, important to activate if you use a Foggate randomizer. The Foggate randomizer would even work if you turn this off, but then the randomized outcome might be often very similar with the routing. And if you activate it without using the Foggate randomizer, you get a little message that says activate the Foggate randomizer every time you enter a new area. and it kind of changes how items can be placed. It might even result in that the randomizer is not completable, but I'm not 100% sure on this. It definitely overrides other settings like logic, early legacy dungeons are available early, and early Mogwin Palace. Dungeon crawl mode in Foggate randomizer is another setting you should activate if you want to use this mode in the Foggate randomizer. Keep in mind when it comes to the Foggate randomizer that in version 0.2.2 the DLC is only supported with the World Shuffle mode, not in the other modes. Disable upgrading Serpent Hunter. This option is maybe interesting for a race or so and you want to restrict that people potentially find the Serpent Hunter early. For example, every time you find Rykard, you get automatically the Serpent Hunter, and it's a really good weapon that a lot of people could use to complete the game, and maybe you want this weapon to be just used versus Rykard. Also, Rykard's lava does no damage, so Rykard is always pretty free. You can just stand in front of him and just hit him until he's dead. Also, you always find the Serpent Hunter in the boss arena of Rykard at the same spot you also find it in the vanilla game. Alternate item placement for Randomania. I think the main thing this setting does, and it's really an interesting setting, is that it places all great runes before the mountaintops. At least with a very high probability. Then we come to the many awesome convenience features. Unlock all map fragments and icons at the start. I like this option because then you don't have to worry about finding all the map icons and can just focus on your playthrough. And also, if you know the game very well already, finding the map fragments is also not that interesting. Unlock all craftable items in crafting kit from the start. This basically removes all the crafting recipes, cookbooks from the game, and you have everything unlocked already. In my opinion, this makes crafting a bit more viable in the randomizer because there are not that many awesome crafting recipes in Elden Ring that are very useful, and sometimes even if you have a useful one, you might not have the materials for it. If you have everything unlocked, you can at least, from the stuff you find, craft the thing you might need, and you do not have to rely on finding the right recipe as well. So that helps quite a bit with it. Disable Melania's heal on hit. If you activate this, then if Melania hits you, she won't heal anymore. This can make fighting Melania a bit more comfortable, and if you struggle with her, this helps quite a bit. Same with the next option, which is one of my favorites. Disable damage tick in Valiant Gargoyles Poison Cloud. So the Poison Cloud of the Gargoyles does not simply poison you and then you're poisoned and lose damage over time. It also has a damage tick if you stand in it. And if you, for example, have Ignore Arena Size activated and you find them in a very small arena, this can be insanely annoying. It's sometimes very hard to see, and especially if the gargoyles are scaled up quite a bit, let's say in the Radagon boss arena, then this hits you like a truck. It's a really annoying attack, and they can stall the fight quite a bit, and it's really frustrating. If you activate this, then the Poison Cloud only poisons you and does not in addition also give you damage ticks. The next setting is, I think, one of the most important settings in the randomizer. Reduce upgrade cost for non-somber weapons. That means that instead of 97 smithing stones to upgrade a weapon from 1 to plus 25, you only need 25 smithing stones that are 3 of each smithing stone category versus 10 smithing stones for somber weapons. So it's still a bit more, but it's more manageable. Like finding these 97 or a few less smithing stones in the correct order in a randomizer run is just so unreliable, and as a result, reducing those to 25 helps so much and makes it more viable in comparison to the somber stone weapons. So I would recommend to always activate this setting. Add shortcuts in mountaintops for faster traversal is also a fantastic convenience feature. It allows you, after you defeat Morgoth and go up the elevator over this long bridge, you can there summon Torrent and just ride over it, which is a lot faster than walking. And nothing interesting happens there anyway, so this is a pretty cool feature. Then when you reach the mountaintops, you also get an extra spirit spring, which allows you to skip a huge part of the usual mountaintop way, which is just riding for like literally minutes without anything interesting happening there. So this allows you to naturally skip things, and it also adds some teleporters that allows you to get from the fire giant into the direction of Castle Sol relatively fast as well. There's even a spirit spring that allows you to, if you are not able to do the Castle Sol skip, to just jump down on a spirit spring, jump up and land on Castle Sol, which makes it super safe and easy. So also a really cool addition. It just makes mountaintops so much more enjoyable and faster. Then there are the built-in DLL mods, enable randomizer crash fix.dll. So this helps reducing crashes, removes the startup logo from the beginning and so on. So that's pretty neat. And after that, we have enable randomizer helper.dll. If you activate it, you can click on edit randomizer helper options. This gives you access to two interesting features. First of all, auto equip, and here you can select what equipment is automatically equipped. So if you make a run, use what you just picked up, then this is basically the feature for you. So for example, if you pick up a weapon, it's automatically put in your hand and you have it equipped. And then we also in addition have auto upgrade, which you can activate. What this does is if you upgrade, let's say, your longsword, so a smithing stone weapon, to +10, and you pick up, let's say, a scimitar, then it's also automatically +10. And if you pick up a somber weapon, it will be +4. So even this is calculated. An interesting feature in context of this is auto upgrade items which are left on the ground and picked up again, I would add. So that makes if the weapon you are currently using is of course not upgraded if you upgrade like another weapon or whatever, and it's higher upgraded than the weapon you currently use, but you want to use this weapon, then you can put it on the ground by clicking on leave, not discard, and then pick it up again, and it will also be automatically upgraded to the highest level. With this you can also skip smithing stones, which can be useful, but sometimes feels a bit like cheating though, to be fair. You can also activate that also spirit ashes are also upgraded to the highest level achieved so far, and you can also limit the maximum amount of upgrading a little bit and reduce it, for example. Also, when randomizer helper is active and you change something in this sub menu here, then the changes automatically will apply to the game without re-randomizing it. Then at last I want to briefly talk about custom item placement. If you check this here on the first item randomizer tab and click on edit custom item placement, you have a ton of options what you can do with the custom item placement. For example, there's a field called not randomized. If you add items or key items here to this list, you will find them in the game in their vanilla location. They're not randomized. Also interesting, you can, if you click on the category major key items, you can here also select important locations anywhere or custom. And here you can also say, I don't know, they should also show up at paintings. Alternatively, if you keep this to important locations, you can also click at the very bottom on important locations. And they're also at paintings, for example, as an important location. You can even say just sacred tiers, so all the golden trees with the seeds are excluded. And there's also never placed in, like by default in all these setting major key item locations that major bosses is always added, and it seems like you can't remove it. But you could place those two categories in never placed in, and then they're actually removed. But this kind of is something the randomizer doesn't really like. So if you do this, by my experience, you have to add upgrade bell-bearing locations and overworld mini-bosses to only placed in for the randomizer to work and not give an error. It doesn't matter how many other things you put in, if those two are not in, you often will or mostly will get an error. And this should have covered pretty much all the options there are in this randomizer, which are a ton. So huge shoutouts, respect, and thank you to thefifthmatt for all his work, and this is really one of the best randomizers there is. Thank you people for watching. I hope this was in any shape or form helpful. If so, feel free to press the like button, leave me a comment if you have any questions, suggestions, or maybe things I might have forgotten. Maybe subscribe to my channel, would be much appreciated. Check out my other stuff if you like Lord of the Rings and so on. I also have channels for this, and huge shoutouts and thank you to all my supporters. Thank you so much for your support, and I would say see you people next time, and goodbye.